So, the House of the Dead remake came out the other day, and I have lots of thoughts about it. Mostly negative ones, as you might be able to tell from the title of this video. This is going to be a somewhat loosely structured rant. I don't even have a script prepared for this, I'm just shooting from the hip. And all footage is exclusively from my stream of the game, so you're gonna have to deal with me, little talking head in the corner there, because I refuse to put more effort into this than was put into making the game in the first place. And because I have no real structure, I'm just gonna go through things point by point, like an old game trailers review or something, starting with the graphics, which is one of the things I've seen the most critique thrown around about. People don't like how the game looks. I think it looks okay, honestly. I actually kind of like the enemy models. I think they're pretty well done. They look fine, for the most part. What is less fine is I'm not crazy about the way zombies just kind of blob up and fade away when they get killed. Like, that melting effect was in the original as well, but it looked a little less, I don't know, jarring in the original. What is less fine on the visual front is the fact the performance is terrible. Maybe this is because it's launched on the Switch first, but frame drops are very frequent, even if you play on the game's performance mode, which it does prompt you to enable the very first time you boot the game up, so like they knew it ran like shit. But even if you turn that on, it still runs like shit. And that's really bad for a game of this type, because, you know, a slight frame drop means you could get hit. It's quite hard, it relies on split-second reaction times, and the performance is, frankly, not really acceptable. The original, which I molded so hard about this remake that I actually went and emulated the original and played it through a couple times just to make sure I wasn't completely bugging, ran at a consistent frame rate all the time, something this remake cannot match. So straight away, point number one, it just is worse than the original. Good start. Other knock against the presentation is that for some reason all of the score pop-ups are enabled by default, and you can turn them into like a more minimalist setting in the options, but it doesn't really help, and as far as I know there's no way to permanently disable the score display in the top left. The original didn't display your score by default. In fact, you could only enable it with a cheat code. Because, you know, atmosphere was actually considered important to the game back then. Shocking, I know. So you are constantly saddled with number pop-ups coming out of zombies every time you hit them, which frankly looks kind of ugly. So that's not great either. Alright, stop complaining about the visuals, let's move on to the sound. Particularly the music, 'cause that's what people care about. The new tracks are fine, they sound okay, they sound like they're done by someone who understands what a music is. The problem is that you can never hear it. Any of the music during gameplay, because there's something weird going on with the audio balancing in the remake. Every time you shoot, it like ducks the music, and this is a rail shooter, you're shooting all the time. So you can never really hear the music because it's like ducked out of the mix. All the time. I have no recollection of what any of the remake tracks sound like as a consequence of this. And it's a completely baffling decision considering the original had music blaring quite loudly, fairly prominently in the mix of the game the whole time, because, you know, it's meant to be an arcade, it's supposed to be loud and bombastic and get your attention and stuff like that. Speaking of the original, there is also no option to use either of the original soundtracks, either arcade or Saturn. Swing and a miss, if you ask me. That would have been nice to have as a bonus. Alright, so sound effects. This is what I care about the most, and they're done quite badly in the remake. The gunshot sounds just sound less satisfying, particularly some of the extra weapons. The crossbow sounds like piss. You feel no impact at all when using it. But particularly, the reload sound effect is very jarring, and actually cuts through the mix in a really awkward way, so it like overpowers everything else. If you're shooting and reloading a lot, which again, this is a rail shooter, you're kind of doing that 24/7, you will hear that click, 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 click noise so much that it'll make you want to scream. It's too much. It's too much. And a key subtlety that has been missed that I didn't realize until I went and played through the original again is that zombie sound effects are also kind of off in the remake, right? In the original, when a zombie dies, it has like a special gurgling sound effect for the kill. You might not consciously register this, but you will notice it if you're looking for it. When a zombie is killed, it has like a special that like differs from just being shot and just making an attack, so that when it dies, you'll probably hear it before you see it in all the chaos, and that's very important because it helps you to register that a zombie is dead, change target, or that, you know, there is no more danger, etc, etc. It's good sound design. The remake misses this completely, so you will never know if something's dead until it ragdolls away from you. Which, incidentally, replacing all of the death animations with ragdolls also sucks. Similarly, the hit sound effects for actually hitting a zombie are much more muted in the remake. In the original, you get this wonderful, like, wet noise whenever you strike a zombie, like blood gushing everywhere and stuff. It really helps to feel like you're making contact. It's not only good design in terms of how it makes you feel, It's good design in that it feeds back what the correct play is. You know, if you're hitting the zombie, making your mark, you'll receive audio feedback on this. The remake is quite light on this, which can make it hard to tell when you're slightly missing your mark. Because in the original, if you missed your mark, what you would get is you'd get like a noise instead, like a bullet whizzing past. If I'd had the presence of mind to record the footage I did of playing through the originals, I'd use comparison footage here, but this is a lazy video, so none for you. This general division of sound effects is lost on the remake, so it is a lot harder to tell what's going on in the chaos through just sound and sound alone, which is very important because House of the Dead, even the original, can be quite visually chaotic, and the noise helps the player to cut through that and make sense of what's going on without having to actually visually confirm everything that's happening with their eyes. Sound design like that is very important to games of this type. It's the subtle thing that separates a good game from a great game, and this is not appreciated particularly strongly by the remake, which is a miss. It's another point where I think the original just flat out does it better. There's no comparison to be made. Alright, let's move on to complaining about the controls, or at least I would. The controls, again, seems to be one of the things that's complained about the most by professional reviewers. I actually think they did about as good as they possibly could have with regards to how it controls. The game supports a decent variety of options. On the Switch you can use gyro aiming, which is not as good as a light gun, and it's not even as good as a Wiimote, but that's not really the fault of the game, that's just kind of how gyro technology works. You will need to reset to center quite a lot and like steady your aim and keep a firm control over the gyro, but that's just how gyro controls are. It's okay, it's better than having to play the game with nothing but a pad, because this, again, light gun shooters on pad don't function very well. This is like a known thing, it's not particularly ideal. With regards to the controls, there's actually a wealth of options that you can use to customize your controls, and I recommend you fiddle around with these. Things like automatic reload, which I appreciated having just because the reload sound effect was so jarring and mashing it all the time made it, like, unbearable, so being able to turn it on just to automatically do it when you run out of ammo was appreciated. It does make the game easier, but I don't care. And aim assist, which I would argue is basically necessary if you're going to play this with a pad, and maybe even with gyro, but however, the aim assist is kind of buggy. At one point I got the cursor stuck between two enemies because the aim assist couldn't pick which one to latch onto. That was very entertaining, which makes it doubly entertaining that the highest degree of aim assist per the game's options is labeled filthy casual by the game makers. Fuck you guys. Here's a solid pro tip for you. If your game controls like ass, maybe don't shitpost in the control settings. So my anger thus freshly stoked, let's move on to the thing I think is the most critical flaw in the remake, which is that this is a rail shooter where enemies don't die when you shoot them sometimes for some reason. I haven't seen any professional reviews complaining about this, which is mind-boggling because it seems like a serious problem for the game to have. I'm gonna roll some example clips now of my playthrough of when I would just shoot things and various major parts of the enemy would be destroyed and they would still hit me. I especially don't agree with that. That guy was definitely dead. I'm not sure this will do very well against this phase, because it fires a bit too slowly. No, it does very poorly against that. Reload! Garbage! Garbage! I think a bat without a head just hit me. I think a bat that I already shot just hit me. This kind of shit happens just all the time in the remake, and it's absolutely maddening. Even smaller enemies like the larval dudes and the bats can sometimes be hit in such a way that their entire head is blown off, but they're still able to hit you. Why? Those enemies were only ever supposed to take one hit. This should never ever be happening with these enemies. I don't even know how this is happening. It's not a remake change that they have like multiple hits now, it just seems like a bug. But it's a pervasive bug that permeates down into every single encounter in the whole game. Sometimes you can blow a zombie's head clean off, and they'll still take a swing at you. In the original, if you blew off a zombie's arm and they tried to swing at you with that arm, they would miss. This effect is attempted in the remake, but it seems a lot less reliable, meaning zombies missing body parts will very often still hit you without that body part. And in the original, if you took off a zombie's head, you definitely killed it. Now, there are many instances where, like, a zombie with a half-destroyed head could still hit you. House of the Dead 1 was not free of bullshit, but, you know, it is what it is. But in this game, you can take off the whole head and an arm and get hit by either, even though it doesn't have them anymore. This absolutely drives me nuts when playing this game. Like, in this regard, a rail shooter has fundamentally one job, which is that when enemies are shot, they're supposed to die, and this is something that the remake cannot accomplish consistently, which is a fatal flaw. I am quite familiar with the original House of the Dead, and I think you would be surprised to learn how quite reasonable it can be about its game design sometimes. It gets pretty difficult in some bosses towards the back end, but for the most part, you actually have a pretty reasonable amount of time to react to what's coming at you, and deal enough damage to destroy zombies. In the remake, particularly on the higher difficulty settings, I often feel like damage might just be completely unavoidable. Like, good luck to anyone who feels like 1cc'ing this game on the higher difficulties, at least without using the super broken bonus weapons. I personally almost immediately thought it wouldn't be worth the effort. And like, I am someone who has 1cc'd the original, like it's possible, it can be done. I wouldn't say it's a freakish level of difficulty. And now, let's talk about the bosses, because I think this is a very good, like, miniature showcase of how the remake fails to understand the design tenets of the original. The very first boss, for instance, Chariot, has a weak point, where if you strike him, he steps backwards, but if you don't strike it, he steps forwards and eventually hits you. Simple, right? Like, he's the first boss, so it's supposed to be a simple fight. In the remake, he never steps back for some reason, even when you hit him, so he's just constantly getting closer to you all the time, resulting in like a frantic mash at the end to get him to go away. And it's very bizarre that they've done this. Like, this boss is not supposed to be hard. It's the first boss, guys. And in particular, in Chariot's second phase, when all his armor comes off and he just becomes sort of like a mass of flesh, in the original, only one hit to a particular body part is needed to stun him and reduce that part to nothing. The point was to make it so you had to hit different parts of the body to deal all the damage. For some reason, in the remake, it takes like a solid 4 or 5 hits to each part of the body to take the flesh off. Why? Why was that changed? It makes the boss not a matter of accuracy, but a matter of mash fest. Why would you do that? The second boss had its weak point retracted to just the upper torso instead of the whole body like it was in the original. I don't know why, it was already pretty hard to hit in the first place. But this is where it highlights a fundamental change to how boss fights work that really hurts the whole game, which is that in the original, when bosses were struck, they flashed white, and you got a different, crunchier hit sound effect. Both of these are absent from the remake, so it's very hard to tell if you're doing damage to Hangman properly. And that's a problem, because he's far away. You can't really tell, unless you take your eyes off the game to sort of look upwards at the health bar while you're shooting, and if you're looking there, you can't aim properly, so it's a big mess, whereas it's really clear if you're hitting in the original. Very clear, crystal clear, great sound design, great visual design. It's very gamey, in that, you know, bosses flashing white when hit is super video gamey, but this is a video game-ass video game, who cares? And one change to Hangman that permeates down through the rest of the bosses we'll be talking about is a change to how invincible frames work. Hangman had very little invincible frames in the original, even while he was flying around and not doing an attack. When he swept in for an attack, you had to hit him then to repel the attack, but while he's flying around, if you could tag him with extra hits, you would do extra damage. That is absent from the remake for some reason. It is purely cycle-based. All bosses in the remake are purely cycle-based, and if they're not in their specific vulnerable phases of attack, you can't deal damage. This sucks, and I have no idea why they would change it. It makes every fight so much more canned, so much more boring, and so much more hard to push your limits on. The third boss, Hermit, is similarly affected by these changes. Hermit was a pushover in the original, and is still kind of a pushover here, but you can only deal damage to it when it goes in to swipe you. Not before, even if you can hit the head, which makes it take a lot longer than it used to for some reason, because you are not rewarded for participating in the fight outside of certain predetermined moments. I don't know why it's like this, it just results in a lot of waiting that did not exist originally. These fights were not like this originally. You could always do damage to a boss if you could hit its weak point, with a couple of exceptions, but whatever. The final boss, Magician, is where that becomes a really bad problem, because the whole point of the Magician fight has fundamentally changed in this remake in a way that makes it worse. Magician throws fireballs at you, and if you hit him in his weak point, which is these red spots on his body, you deal damage. In the remake, they made it so that if you hit him in his weak spots while he's attempting to throw a fireball, it cancels the projectiles in flight. This is not the case in the original, which actually makes the original harder, but in like a more interesting way. Because the point of the fight in the original is that it's about how much damage can you comfortably do before you need to defend against the projectiles. In the remake, it's just hit the points and then he stops attacking and this goes on for far too long. And again, because it's cycle-based, you do a little bit of damage, he moves to a new location, throws a new set of fireballs at you, you hit him again, you do a little bit of damage, repeat, repeat, repeat. It's perfectly cycle-based. In the original, if you kept hitting the guy, you would keep doing damage. You could tear through his health bar really quickly if you're a sharpshooter and you could, like, get enough hits off on his very small weak point accurately enough. That's good. That's dynamic. It's interesting gameplay. In the remake, it's so canned. I don't know why they would make it like that. And furthermore, he seems to pick his attacks randomly in the remake, which is very strange, because in the original it moves in 3 very distinct phases. Whereas in the remake, it seems like he alternates between attack types. Even his, like, dash around the screen and swipe at you attack has been made noticeably slower in the remake, but again, you can't do as much damage during it, so even though it's, like, easier, it feels more boring. And this attack, where he throws up all these balls in the air, in the original, you could keep shooting him while he was charging, and you would do a lot of damage. That was the vulnerable time in the original. That was the point to do all the damage that you could do. In this version, he's invulnerable during this animation, mostly, except when he's not. Not that you'll be able to tell visually, you just have to keep shooting and some of it will count, but most of it won't. And that sucks, that feels terrible, and it also makes that entire sequence take way too long. This may sound like a minor change, like, oh, boss invuln frames are different, what a big deal, Punchy, who cares, but like, it changes the premise of the fight's design completely. From something that was dynamic and interactive and active, into something that's like passive, cycle-based, and you can't really stretch beyond your bounds. It makes it something that's way more boring, and way more irritating too. Because it turns out that, shockingly, waiting for your turn is not a very interesting form of gameplay in a railgun shooter. So those are my major points. Now I'm going to complain about something a lot pettier, which is the scoring system. There are 2 scoring systems presented in this game, Classic and Modern, and both of them break the games in different ways. Classic is not the original scoring system. It actually is a different scoring system, but it's just labeled Classic because, I don't know, where killing enemies has a fixed point value and headshots do extra damage, etc, etc. But the thing I want to complain about is that in the original, you got a different ending based on what your score was, and in particular what the final digit was marked as. When you continued in the original, you gained +1 to your score. So there was a requirement for some of the endings that your final digit had to be 0, because it was a 1cc check. This requirement has been kept in the remake. In order to get the secret ending, you need to score below a certain amount and have your final digit be 0, which would be fine, except the remake adds things that score points in multiples of 5. Meaning whether or not you can consistently try and land that ending type is no longer based on how you play, but whether or not you accidentally score something that gave you +5 right at the end for some reason. And modern scoring breaks the game in a different way, because in order to get the true ending you had to score above a certain amount, something the modern scoring makes almost trivial, because modern scoring adds a combo multiplier to your scoring, which means you get significantly higher points. Classic scoring generally scores in the tens of thousands. Modern scoring will get into the hundreds of thousands very easily, making it almost impossible to not get the true ending if you play with modern scoring, because this clearly wasn't thought out. The 2 modes don't have different scoring requirements for the endings. They were just lifted wholesale from the original with seemingly no consideration for how changes made to the scoring would affect them. And that's petty, sure, but it's a lack of consideration that permeates down into other aspects of the game, like the text. Ooh, surprisingly good transition for something I'm not scripting at all. All of the on-screen text that you have to read with your eyeballs is a mess in English. The English translation is completely fucked. It's tense. Justifies. Including watching Dr. Curian's every move. Hi. Top agent of now defunct AMS agency. Now defunct? What? Okay. Specialized in infiltration and rescue missions. He is impulsive, but in an emergency situations. What the fuck? That sentence is tripping me the fuck up. He is impulsive, but in an emergency situations, perfect evaluate risk. Am I reading? He met Sophia in college, her name is Sophie, and married her after 6 months. Before the incident, he had the opportunity... Married her after 6 months? In places, it genuinely feels like machine translation. The studio who made this game is a Polish studio, so neither the English or the Japanese is the original language as far as I can tell. But either way, the English script is full of typos, strange grammar, and just a whole lot of errors that imply that this just wasn't given the love and care that it requires, which is crazy considering this is Sega published. Sega has one of the best localization departments in the business, but clearly they didn't care enough to lend a hand with House of the Dead Remake for some reason. Why would you care when, you're remaking one of the foundational classics of the medium, right? And, more damningly still, this game contains some instances of just flat-out plagiarism. Chunks of the game's in-game text regards to character bios and enemy bios are just lifted wholesale from the House of the Dead wiki. And you may be thinking, oh, but they were credited in the credits, Punchy. You know, clearly it was all above board. No, that only happened when they got called out on Twitter for lifting passages wholesale from the House of the Dead wiki. Which is especially funny because some of the things that have been copied from the wiki don't make any sense in the context of the game they've been copied into. Saying Rogan is a member of the now-defunct AMS agency, which isn't true in the context of House of the Dead 1. It doesn't get, like, disbanded until a later game, but they've copied that from the wiki without looking at it. I know no one cares about the plot of these games, but, like, still, if you're remaking the game, please pay attention! And now we get to the aspect of the text that made me feel like I had to make this video at all, which is that it's full of shitposting. It's full of just childish horse shit in all of the writing. Right, now, what Joy-Con am I actually using to aim with? This is... Why was there an emoji on the screen there for a moment? So creatures, much zombie, very horror, thank you. And that was what compelled me to complain about it in this format in the first place, because it's one thing to make a bad game, it's another thing to go the extra mile and, like, wipe your ass with it in a way that makes me question whether or not you're even competent enough for the job you've been asked to do. But loading screens and tooltips are full of just, like, outdated internet memes, emojis for some reason, and at the end of the credits you get thanks for playing with, like, an ASCII smiley at the end. Like, what is this? What are you doing? What is this completely unprofessional horseshit? You're remaking one of the foundational classics of the medium here. Please take it seriously. This is absolutely unbearable. I mentioned it before as well, but the highest degree of aim assist in the control settings is also called filthy casual. And this general attitude of not giving a shit reflected in this shitposty text is the reason that I have to seriously question why Sega is even giving these games to these people in the first place. Because okay, I wanted to be charitable at first. I thought, you know, maybe they weren't given enough time or enough money to make these games as good as they could be. That happens all the time. It's not usually indicative of incompetent developers. But publisher support or no, the publisher probably wasn't making them wipe their ass with the text like this, so I have to get the impression that they're just not taking it seriously, that they just don't care. All of this stuff adds up to make a game that has an extremely amateurish vibe from it, and not something you would expect from a Sega-published remake of, again, one of the foundational classics of the genre. Between this game and the Panzer Dragoon remake, which also released in a completely dire state, I have to wonder what it is that Sega thinks they're doing with this. Like, why are they farming out these remakes, clearly not really funding them properly, but also handing off to people who don't really seem to care about them in the first place? Why are they doing this? So that's the House of the Dead remake. It's a serious candidate for worst remake I've ever played, probably the worst game I'm going to play this year, and is overall a very bad, no good game that you shouldn't buy at all. If this is the absolute best they can do, they should cancel the House of the Dead 2 remake immediately because nothing would be better than this. I genuinely think that this is dreadful. It is a game so bad it makes me question the competence of the people involved, and why it is even being done this way in the first place. Do not buy, do not play, this is not an acceptable release. Goodbye.